In this video, we're going to be discussing the data types provided to us in JavaScript. Now, when we talk about data types, we are talking about the various ways in which we store and utilize data within our applications. And types refer to the different kinds of data that we're storing. And because different data is manipulated and modified in different ways based on the type of that data, JavaScript provides us several different data types. And each of those types have different functions and methods and abilities that they can perform or have performed on them in order to use and manipulate that data. So in this video, we're going to quickly go through the primary data types that JavaScript provides. Now, if you're familiar with other programming languages, a lot of other programming languages provide you with a lot more data types. JavaScript has limited the amount of data types by limiting the number of numeric data types to pretty much one primary data type and then a secondary that is used less often. And we'll get to that when we hit the numeric data types. But you might be surprised at the limited number of data types JavaScript has. You might find that liberating and you might find it very constraining. It depends on how you've programmed in the past and your preferences. So let's begin with the most basic or the most commonly used data type that JavaScript provides for us, and that is the string. So we're going to use let, of course, as we've talked about in our variable assignment video. Let is the one that we should be using for declaring variables. So let's do let first name, and let's have it equal Tim. And right there we declared a string variable of the data type string. Now, you'll notice that in other languages, you would probably, or usually like C# or Java, you would say string first name equals Tim. And that would be how you would declare a variable, because you would provide the actual data type right here, string, that the variable is going to be made of. Well, JavaScript, just like Ruby, just like Python, just like a bunch of other languages, is a dynamically typed language. What this means is that every variable that you define does not have a strict data type assigned to it. Instead, the JavaScript interpreter behind the scenes will infer or dynamically assign the data type to the variable based on the data that was put into the variable or assigned to the variable. In this case, we've got ourselves a string literal, and JavaScript knows that is a string literal, and therefore when it puts that value into first name will dynamically become a string data type, and JavaScript will treat it as such because that's what it contains. Another way to think of that is you might hear commonly referred to as duck typing. And what that is the explanation behind it is if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and acts like a duck, then it's a duck. So let's treat it like a duck. And so that's pretty much what a lot of these dynamically typed languages do, is whatever that data is that got assigned to the variable, it's going to treat it as is, as what it is. It doesn't need us to explicitly set the type. Some developers are comfortable with that, some developers are not. It really comes down to a preference thing in reality. So as we see here, we went ahead and we set first name. So if we call first name and then we let the console output the value of it, we'll see that it has a string Tim in it. So strings, very basic. They're really just an array of characters or a sequence of characters that have a specific meaning in the language of whatever we're programming in. So here we're programming in language, and Tim, or the sequence of letters TIM, represents a first name, and we have a first name as a string. All right, really simple. So the next data type that we have is a number. Now, in other languages, you may find that you'll have a data type called integer for numbers without decimals. You'll find ones that have double. For those that do have decimals, you'll find float for floating point numbers, and you'll have a bunch of different data types for the different types of number types that we have in the programming world. JavaScript keeps it simple by allowing number to handle both integers, decimals, and floating points all in one data type, and it just takes care of typing it to whatever that underlying type is on its own, just like we saw with string. So if we say let age equal 100, we'll see once we call age, the value is 100. It doesn't have quotes wrapped around it, therefore we see that it is treating age as a number. And if we want to go ahead and use a double or a floating point, we can do that as well. So here we'll do a double. We'll just do it for the price of something, and it is $5.50. And if we call out price again, we'll see it is 5.5. So we've got ourselves a decimal precision number right there. So numbers really useful for your integers, doubles, and floating points. It gives you double precision. One thing that you'll run into, which isn't unique to JavaScript, but you will find across all programming languages, each data type that supports numbers has a limited length or support for a large number. So in this case, if we want to talk about the max integer, we can go ahead and take number and then go to the max safe integer and load that into a variable. And if we see that put out to our JavaScript console, we'll see that the biggest integer that a number can hold is this number right here. It's massive. Okay, but sometimes when we're doing mathematical calculations or operations, or we're doing some really heavy mathematics in JavaScript, we may actually run into that ceiling. And if we look at this, if we do, so max integer, and let's go ahead and add 1 to it, we can see that that really wasn't the max integer. The max integer could actually go up by 1. But if we try to do that again, we'll see that it did not add 1 to it. We went from 991 at the end of this number to a 992, and then even though we tried to add 1 to it, it's a 992. If we add another 1 to it, as you can see, we have reached the limit of a number in JavaScript. That is the highest number we could ever possibly calculate using a number. Now, a way around that is the one other number data type that JavaScript provides us, which is a big integer. Now, the big integer allows us to create integers with arbitrary precision, and we use an n as a modifier to let JavaScript know that we are using a big integer data type instead of just number. So if we put an n at the end, and if we add 1n to it, we will see that we made it past the limit of number. So the biggest max safe integer, which was that 992 at the end. Now we're at a 993. If we do it again, oops, look, we're only at a 993. So let's try to add 10 to it. 10n. Now we can see that we did add 10 to it. And let's try to add maybe 50 to it. And we can see that we added 50 to it. So right here, we can see that using the big integer, we can go past the limits of our regular number. It's going to be rare that you're going to run into using the big integer unless you're doing some serious calculations and some serious math in your JavaScript, which usually I find that any big mathematical operations or calculations or anything like that, you're usually going to be doing that on the back end, not on the front end in your user interface. You're going to have back-end systems doing that. So you'll have an underlying programming language or framework like .NET, Java, Ruby, Python, PHP, or JavaScript running on Node, and then you'll have all those calculations usually running in the background, unless you're doing some serious math in your JavaScript frameworks. The next big one that we want to work with is going to be Booleans, or true and false values. So let's say let vote equal true. And if we call up vote and let it execute in the terminal, we'll see that that value is true. And if their vote changes to false, we call vote again, we can see that it's false. So Boolean values are really just true or false. And that's really all there is to it. Now, Boolean values are used all of the time as the result of expressions when we're doing looping, iteration, or we're dealing with if-else statements. Super important for programming when you are trying to create logical branches in your code based on the results of some event, and you're testing to see if the results are true or false. And if it's true, you want it to do something else, and if it's false, you want it to do something different. So true or false, or Boolean expressions, or Boolean values, sorry. All right, the other big ones that you're going to run into are undefined and null. Now, when we create a value, has no value. So when we create a variable and we define it, but we don't initialize it, in other words, we don't assign it a value, you will notice that it returns undefined. You'll also notice if we look up here, once we defined a variable and we assigned it, sometimes it comes back undefined. That one right there is because anytime we do an expression, if we don't explicitly return a value, JavaScript returns undefined for us. And that's because JavaScript is set up so that every expression once executed, it expects a return value by default. And if you don't return a default value, JavaScript's going to return undefined for you. So that's why we see undefined after we execute a statement where we don't explicitly return a value. So you'll see that often when we define something. But when we actually call for its value like we did right here, you will see that the value held within has no value is undefined. And that is JavaScript's way of telling us that we have not provided a value for that variable yet. In other words, it's waiting for us to assign a value. So if we were to move on through our code and actually use this has no value variable, we would get back an undefined, and we could get back some warnings or errors by trying to use a variable that is undefined if we're running in strict mode. All right, so those are empty values. Now, sometimes in your program, you may not have a value for a variable yet. So let's work with a variable. So here we have birth date, or calculated birth date. So calculated birth date, we don't have a value for it yet. We could just simply leave it as undefined, like this. But sometimes it's not good practice to leave things as undefined. Sometimes we want to make sure that we explicitly set the value to empty or null. So in this case, I'm going to say let calculated birth date. And so for calculated birth date, instead of leaving it to undefined, I'm just going to set it to null. Oh, I already declared let it. All right, so let's let calculated day of month. So we're going to calculate the day of the month. Instead of leaving it as undefined, we're going to go ahead and set it to null. We are explicitly telling the system that we have not provided a value for this variable yet. And so we can check for null later on in our program to find out if we've actually had that date calculated or that day of the month calculated. Now, where this comes in handy is if we are relying on a third-party API or some kind of long-running process that we call asynchronously, which means we're not waiting for its return the second we call it, and it's going to come back at some time in the future, but we don't know when. We may choose to set the variable that we end up putting that value in to null so that later on we can check. We can say something like, if calculated day of month equals null, we want to do something. Else, let's do something else, right? So that's where we would be checking to see if we have the value yet after we've explicitly set null. So it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish in your program. Some developers frown upon this, some developers use it frequently. It all comes down to what you're trying to accomplish and what means you have to accomplish it. And so if you have to set a variable to null and then check later, go for it. It works just fine. All right, so those are all of the data types we have in JavaScript. Again, strings, which are just a sequence of characters, numbers, which hold integers, decimals, and floats. And then you've got big integer when you need to go to big precision with an arbitrary precision. You've got Booleans with true or false values. And then you have your empty values, undefined and null.